One of my favorite things about Fire Emblem's support system is its ability for one support chain to completely recontextualize entire characters, both in the support and out of the support. That beautiful sniper you got halfway through the game? Well, wouldn't you know, she's the ex-wife of that random thief you got earlier in the game. That charming Russian mercenary you randomly got in the desert? He actually has a history with that Khan you helped dethrone several chapters ago. Fire Emblem has a plethora of relationships, lore drops, and all kinds of things hidden away in its supports, which help you learn more about your roster and the world. You never know when a conversation between Joe Schmo A and Joe Schmo B will end up being an incredible experience. And perhaps there is no greater example of a Joe Schmo being really important than Renault from Fire Emblem 7. Despite being a late-game pre-promote that very few players have ever actually used, he has a very strong connection to the game's main villain and ties to multiple characters in the player's army. And I think it's worth diving into the most important unassuming man in Fire Emblem. So please, have a seat and get ready to learn about Renault. But before you do, please consider liking and subscribing. I know asking to do that before a video starts is tacky, so I'm not asking, I'm threatening. If you don't leave a like on this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel, I'm going to break into your house while you sleep and unplug your phone charger so that your phone is dead when you wake up in the morning.
There is no meme. This is just a threat.
The way that Renault is introduced to the player is a lot like his character, seemingly innocuous. He's just chilling out in some ruins when you go to invade the main villain's stronghold on Dread Isle. He doesn't do anything yet, and just gives you a goddess icon and leaves. This doesn't exactly fill the player with wonder as to who he is. You're not going to be playing Battle Before Dawn and thinking to yourself, who was that mysterious old man? It's just to set the stage that he's there on Dread Isle, and when you see him again at the end of the game, you go, oh yeah, that guy. Speaking of, when you see him at the end of the game, his introduction is also fairly bland. He just says that he wants some peace and quiet, and if fighting the morphs gets him that, then he'll do it. And he joins you ready to help for the game's final maps. And that's it. For most players, he joins like that, and then they never use him, and then they see his epilogue, which is the Agma and Navarre classic of a guy just fucking off and leaving. With his epilogue saying, quote, "No one knew the old him. No one knows what became of him. He vanished as though he never existed." This ending, combined with his very lackluster introductions, make him prime for just being someone the player doesn't care about. It is highly unlikely a player is ever going to use Renault. And they kinda weaponize that, because they make you work for his supports and the lore drops therein. Because not only are you very unlikely to use Renault, his supports are also really difficult to get. Back in the Game Boy Advance games, if you wanted units to unlock a support conversation, you would have them sit next to each other and end your turn a whole bunch of times in order to unlock a support. But Renault only shows up with there being 2 maps left in the game, so the only way he can get all 3 supports is because the final map of the game is split into 2 chunks, so you would have to find a way to end your turn a whole bunch of times in the first half of the final chapter, so when the second half of the final chapter begins, Renault can get an A support with someone. It's very, very difficult and obnoxious, and they almost certainly did this on purpose. Renault is the hardest character in the game to get supports for. Other than Carla, but I'm going to ask you to not think about Carla, because I have an agenda to push. So what happens if you put in all of the work to get Renault supports? Well, as I talk about them, I'm going to choose to frame them as us looking through Renault's life. So, how did Renault begin his journey? As nothing more than a simple mercenary. In his Wallace support, Wallace approaches Renault and remarks that he reminds him of a mercenary he once knew. When Wallace was just a wee little 10-year-old lad, he was scrawny and wimpy, and everyone made fun of him. But a mercenary, who went by Renault the Impervious, helped teach him the ways of the battlefield, and was someone Wallace greatly respected as a friend and mentor. And here our Renault is, a bishop, not a mercenary, but the same name and the splitting image of the man Wallace remembered. But Wallace remarks that this was 30 years ago, so it couldn't possibly be the same Renault. The Renault Wallace knows has to have been long dead, but Wallace wanted to meet him again because that Renault was a very kind man who fought for the people and was always with justice in his heart. Now, the most important thing this support teaches the player is that Wallace has gone completely bald by his 40s, which, in the grand scheme of male baldness, is a grade of could have been better, could have been worse. The other thing it teaches the player depends on when you've heard more of Renault's story. If you've gotten his other supports, you already know what Renault's deal is, and this is just an interesting look into his past. But if you haven't gotten more of Renault's supports, it's kind of a mystery. Because clearly, this Renault is one and the same with Wallace's. If it were the real world, you might be able to chalk it off as a coincidence, but this is a video game written by people. They wouldn't have the exact same name and likeness if they weren't meant to be the same person. So the player is left wondering, how has Renault not aged in 30 years? And why is he a bishop now and not a mercenary? Many questions the player has, which will get answered by Canis' support. For in Renault's life as a mercenary, he had a very good friend. Now, his friend is never given a name, and me just referring to him as friend over and over again is going to get kind of obnoxious, so I'll call him Zach. Yeah, Renault's friend was Zach. Anyways, Zach fucking died. Renault's best friend and lifelong companion died, as all mercenaries eventually do. But Renault was not willing to accept that he lost his best friend. He was willing to do anything to get him back. And that leads us to the game's main villain, Nergal, and Renault's support with Canis. Renault's Canis support starts with Canis being the big dumb nerd that he always is. Upon learning that Renault has stayed at the Dread Isle for quite some time, Canis wants to know everything Renault knows about morphs, the homunculi created by Nergal in his never-ending quest for power. Canis wants to know if Renault thinks morphs have a soul, given their nature as artificial life forms. A very, very dangerous question to ask. Just look at my boys, the Geth. As the support goes on and Canis asks more questions, Renault keeps answering, but they're answers that are very specific. He speaks of Nergal's own mentality about the morphs he creates. He remarks on what happens when morphs are thrown away. He keeps saying things that don't make any sense for him to know. After all, he would have had to have been there when Nergal created morphs centuries ago. Which, that's not possible. Haha, unless. For Renault reveals in the final support that when a mercenary a long time ago lost his best friend, he willingly signed up to be with Nergal. He volunteered himself as a guinea pig for Nergal's dark acts and knew that it would make him something less than human. This mercenary is, of course, Renault himself. This support is really good because at the end of the B support, you're left with a mystery. Why does Renault know these things? Which makes it satisfying when you unlock the A support and you're finally told what Renault is. I've mentioned this in a video before, but supports in Fire Emblem can kind of act as their own 3-act structure, and because the game knows that you have to work for the next support level after getting one, it can use that time to build suspense, and Renault does that very well. It also helps that his information, while very interesting and makes for a really cool character, isn't entirely necessary. You don't need to know how Nergal created morphs. You're just told Nergal's an evil wizard and he learned to do evil wizard shit, which that's more than enough. But Renault helps fill in a gap there, which makes Nergal more interesting to learn how much he had to work to get his powers, and also makes Renault a very fascinating character. A man torn by grief who wasn't dumb enough, but rather desperate enough to make a deal with the devil. It's a very fascinating concept for a character, and is one of those characters that's very easily to latch onto. Everyone has lost a loved one in their lives, so anyone can empathize with Renault's emotions, even if his decision on what to do with those emotions is not exactly the best. Because as the player learns in the main story, the way Nergal makes morphs is through gaining quintessence, an innate power in every human being. So, if Nergal was going to start making morphs, he needed powerful quintessence. So Renault, as his assistant, would go around killing powerful foes. And this brings us to his Lucius support, where Lucius, being a fellow man of the cloth, meets with Renault and starts talking about his history. Lucius remarks that he has a sickness of the soul, given to him when he saw his father, a famous mercenary, get murdered by a thief many, many years ago. The only thing Lucius had to remember his father by was the dagger that was plunged into him when he was killed, and Renault recognizes the dagger, and realizes that he was the man who killed Lucius's father. I like this reveal for a few reasons. One, it doesn't outright tell you why Renault did it. In the A support, he remarks that it was because he was bringing back his dead friend, as we learned from the Canis support, but it doesn't tell you why killing Lucius's father would help him with that. It trusts the player's intelligence. When Lucius remarks that his father was a famous mercenary, and the player knows that Renault was Nergal's assistant, that's enough for them to remember, oh right, Nergal said that he can get quintessence from powerful souls, so you know immediately why Renault targeted him like he did. It also has a very nice moment for Renault, showing his deep remorse for the foolish actions he took. He truly feels horrible for what he did to Lucius, and Lucius, because he's a saint, forgives Renault, because he can see in Renault's soul and see that he truly has felt horrible. He truly is trying to repent for all the horrors that he did, which also explains why he's a bishop when the player meets him. All of his talk is of him being a mercenary, so why isn't he a hero? Because when he was in the depths of despair, realizing just how horrible of a human, if he can even call himself that anymore, he's become, he found his solution in God, converting into the clergy and becoming the bishop that you see him as in-game. This is very, very cleverly shown by Renault's stat line. Renault's worst stat is his magic, which is very strange for a very, very high level pre-promoted bishop. But his best stats are his skill, speed, and bulk, which is very atypical of the bishop class line, but very typical of the mercenary hero class line. His stats paint a picture of who he initially was. As a convert, he's naturally gifted as a physical fighter, so the magic stuff isn't really something he's good at. It's a genius case of gameplay story integration that I really, really like. But him being a bishop is more than just repentance and a class line. He is still a man of the cloth, and in his Isadora support, she approaches him and attempts to do a confessional. As a man of the cloth, he listens, and Isadora remarks that even though she fights for her kingdom, and as a knight is confident that she does the right thing, she still feels regret that she's taken human lives. Even if those lives were the evil bandits that you see litter every Fire Emblem early game, Isadora still feels doubt, still feels remorse for having to kill, even if she still, at the end of the day, believes it's the right thing to do, and she's not sure how to process that. And I really like Renault's answer to her, as he says, quote, "If I could give you one direction, one step along the path, it would be to let yourself be lost. Forgiving your sins is a small task for a bishop, and if that were enough to save you, I would recite the words. But you suffer, and you seek answers. And that is the greatest pain of all, the pain of doubt. If I dispelled this doubt, I could free you from your pain. But then you should be nothing more than a puppet that kills. Use your doubt. Use it to be something more. I think it makes you human. Whether you will ever find answers, I don't know. But you must live with your doubt until then. If you can, then all of the joy and sorrow you experience will truly belong to you." This is one of the most classic ways of storytelling. Renault is saying something to Isadora, but he's also really saying it to himself. The doubts Renault has experienced over his own life and his own choices are going to haunt him until his final days, and he has to live with that, and in some ways, he's accepted it. He's trying his best to move forward from the man he once was, one small step at a time, and I think that's really inspiring, because not everyone is fucked up so bad that they've helped the most evil wizard in the world create an artificial army, but we've all fucked up, done things that we regret. And rather than trying to forget the things that we've done wrong, you just gotta remember that you did them wrong so you don't do them wrong the next time. I really like the lesson Renault's character teaches here. But one more thing to talk about. Whatever happened to Renault's friend? Whatever happened to good old Zack? Did he ever actually come back? Well, if you take Renault into battle against Nergal, on Hector mode, he will have a boss conversation with Nergal, where it's revealed that Nergal technically upheld his end of the deal. He did bring back Zack, but not as a being with free will or any sort of emotions. Zack was just nothing more than a corpse paraded around long after he died. Kind of an awful lot like what's happening to Zack now. And Nergal does the normal evil thing of laughing at him and saying, "That's what you wanted, right? I brought your best friend back from the dead." And Renault vows to bring Nergal down. I really like this because if you look at other characters in the game, it gives you an interesting timeline for Nergal. We know that Nergal's first morph was a dead puppet, essentially. No free will of its own, just a body moving around at Nergal's orders. At some point, Nergal realized that morphs made with human emotions were stronger, which is the story of Kishuna, who this video's not about, but that poor bastard suffers a lot. And that also ties in with Renault's support about morphs having souls, because a big part of Kishuna's character is that he was suffering and in agony, and his soul wanted rest. So we learned that Nergal started with Renault's friend, then moved on to Kishuna, and then moved on to his perfect morphs, Ephidel, Linstella, and Sonia. It's very fascinating that we can piece a timeline together of Nergal's actions, and I think that's really cool. What's a bit harder to piece together is a timeline for Renault, which I've been racking my brain at this, and it doesn't make much sense to me. So we know that Renault was with Nergal when he first started trying to make morphs centuries ago. The exact time isn't known, but it's roughly 300 years ago when Nergal was ousted from Arcadia and started to make morphs. So, okay, Renault has an elongated lifespan because of that. Makes sense. But what doesn't make sense is the Wallace support. If Renault was with Nergal 300 years ago and had already discarded his mercenary lifestyle to become an evil servant, why was he with Wallace where he was seemingly still a good man? Maybe it was after he made morphs and he had already started to go down the path to redemption, but then he also killed Lucius's father for Nergal, which at that point, Nergal had already started making morphs, so Renault helping him with the first morph only, I want to say 15 years ago would be when Lucius's father died? That doesn't make any sense either. The only way Renault's timeline makes sense to me personally is if Nergal had been researching quintessence 300 years ago, but he didn't actually start putting quintessence into morphs until much more recently, which would add up with Renault being a good guy with Wallace 30 years ago, and then suddenly becoming a murderer with Lucius about 15 years ago. But that also doesn't work because it's directly stated that Renault helped make the first morph. So nothing about this really adds up. If someone in the comments is just smarter than me, maybe you can clue me in, but as it stands from my perspective, Renault's timeline is a little fucky, but I think the concept of his character and the really good scenes with him makes up for it. Just don't think about it too hard. And if you're wondering about his last support, it's one that's more for comedy than seriousness, because it's with Bartray, the comedy man. It does have a little bit of Bartray realizing Renault's a lot physically stronger than he lets on, which, you know, bleeds into the mystery of who Renault really is, but it's mostly for comedy. It's mostly Bartray being a fucking idiot and Renault bouncing off of him. It's why Bartray also supports with Dorcas, Raven, Canis, Carla, and Renault. Bartray's whole shtick is that he's given very stern and serious people to bounce off of, which is really funny. So I don't have much to analyze, but there is this funny exchange, so I'll throw it in the video. "You don't fool me! I can spot a true warrior. Why, of the last 10 men I spotted, nearly half were strong warriors." So you're only right half the time. Nearly half! All in all, I really like Renault because he's kind of the peak of what Fire Emblem supports can be, offering a very interesting character that a player can either relate to or learn from, expanding the mythos of the world around him, and also just being very rewarding to learn about. Renault's entire existence kind of reminds me of a belief held by Kirby and Smash frontrunner Sakurai. He once said that cutscenes are a reward for the player, and I think Renault is the perfect example of what he means. If you were just given all of Renault's supports or everything about him in a glossary or just something you could read easily in-game, I don't think Renault would be as interesting. But because he comes so late, because his supports are so hard to get, he really feels like a hidden gem. It feels like, by knowing the truth about who Renault is, you worked for something, and that makes the information feel greater than it is. If you just look up his supports on the wiki, you'll still get a fascinating character. You'll still have a really cool dude, but the fact that you have to work for him like you do makes everything all the sweeter. I think that's an aspect of story in games that really gets overlooked. There's just something about getting the cutscenes by playing the game that means more than if you just watch a cutscene compilation. It's really hard to describe unless you're playing the game yourself, but it really does feel like a reward. And Renault is one of the greatest rewards in the entire series. For a man that looks So unassuming. For a unit that largely boils down to giving Athos the Fortify staff, he is a lot more than he seems. And I think that's really fucking rad. I would like to thank you all for making it to the end of another character analysis video. I know that the history of classes has started to become a huge undertaking, but I haven't quite yet forgotten the series of videos that got me to where I am. I still really care about the writing of all these silly little goobers. If you enjoyed the video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. The thread at the beginning of the video will come true if you don't, so get on that. I would also like to thank the members of my Patreon, whose continued support over at patreon.com/FEMSpaint has made this channel more and more profitable and something that one day might become my job. Then I'll become a slave to the algorithm, I'll experience burnout in 5 years, and then go down a depressive spiral. But hey, it'll be a pretty sweet ride up until that point. My patrons include the likes of Across the Night, Adebayo Thompson, Alex Araliga, Amu is not beating the Tails allegations, Andrew Crockett, Bean Juice, Hell on Heelys, Jae Hyun, Despacito 2, Larmachi, Lichuman, Ly17 Bolt, Morgan Lorgan, Played Arrow, Played is pronounced like the pattern, Rangerman Sam, Sean Vossi, Shen Lu, Viri the Artist, Yugirl Olwyn, Brentendo11, Drew Hack, Fire Emblem Lord, Ginger, Gugu Gaga, Cornelia Milkers 92, Inverse, Lev Maverick, Maple Knight, and Upscale Furry Trash. Thank you all for your continued support, and I'll see you on the next video. But also consider joining my Discord server. We like to have fun there, you're seeing some people in it right now. I am slowly but surely converting them all to be Baltimore Orioles fans. Which, given the history of the Baltimore Orioles, will not end well for anyone involved, but now more people will understand my suffering. Until next time.